Thank you very much. I've been asked to talk about funding of green infrastructure, and I'm thinking about the income streams that might be available for some of those. And I thought a good way of organising this would be to start off with elements from the 25-year plan, which you may have heard of, which was published at the beginning of this year, cross-government plan, but mostly led by DEFRA. And the idea of this plan is to deliver the objectives of the 2011 Natural Environment White Paper, which is to leave the environment in a better state for the next generation than the state it is in now, or at least as good a condition. So the 25-year plan is arranged thematically with on land and water, marine, and so on. And if you look at the opportunities for investment under that plan, you can see that some of them are available immediately because we have the right policy environment to create income streams for them, to pay for them, and some of them offer greater income opportunities than others as well. So I'm going to take you through this very briefly, which is a personal sort of view as to where the income is most available currently. If you look in the top left, that's the best set of opportunities where we have high or regular expected revenue streams, and with the current policy environment, we have access to some of those. If you move to the right, to the top right, we still have the potential for good revenue streams, but not really the sufficient policy backing for all of those currently. And then below the line, the bottom half, we've got lower levels of income for green infrastructure. Again, the left-hand side being available now, and then the right-hand side where there might be some improvements from policy going forwards. So I'd like to concentrate on two or three of these. Two of them because I think they're most relevant to developers and the construction sector, and that's biodiversity and natural capital net gain, which is in that top left-hand box in bold, and the other bold one, place-based strategic investment. That won't mean anything to you because I've just made up that phrase, but I'll explain what it is. And then also perhaps something on sustainable drainage. There are other things in these lists, but I think they're probably less relevant for the construction sector, so I won't cover those. So these two leading candidates are biodiversity and natural capital net gain. Now we are just begun a consultation period for the new national planning policy framework, and it remains to be seen how much of an impetus that's going to give the net gain within the planning regime. The potential here that some of the local authorities are adopting voluntarily and others may follow course with is to say when a developer is negotiating Section 106 agreements with the planning authority or community infrastructure levy arrangements, that it could be required to deliver offsets that compensate for any loss of biodiversity or any loss of natural capital associated with the development. That's most likely to be the case for developments which are outside dense urban areas and therefore using greenfield land. That's potentially really quite a large source of funding for green infrastructure compared with the current existing sources of funding. There are two ways in which it could be taken forward. One is in the piecemeal manner in which we're used to seeing Section 106s operate, which is individual agreements between developers on a particular consent and a planning authority, or to create a pooled system of pooled funds where the contributions, Section 106 contributions, are put into a pool that the local authority has access to, so that the local authority can then use that financial resource to make more strategic investments in a programmatic way and deliver better green infrastructure. And that would be a much more efficient way of delivering infrastructure than the current system. Associated with that pool system, you could introduce finance, so external sources of capital, to allow you to sometimes invest ahead of the Section 106 contributions, or otherwise bring in other sources of revenue to create assets that have multiple sources of income. So that's actually a very, very big opportunity if government decides to push that a bit harder through the planning regime, although it's not looking terribly likely at the moment. The local authorities can still decide independently that they're going to take that forward. The second opportunity is could also use some of this source of funds, but there are other sources of funds it might use. So that's a place-based strategic investment, and what I mean by that is creating vehicles that can have a local focus. So it could be a community interest company, or it could be a charitable trust, or it could be actually you just could stay within a local authority or whatever, and it has a program of a portfolio of assets in a local area which it manages, invests in, improves, and so on. And those would be green infrastructure assets or blue infrastructure assets. We have one example so far in Newcastle where they're setting up a parks trust to run all the parks in Newcastle. That's a model that could be replicated elsewhere, but you can also think of it working in a coastal environment with, instead of parks in the middle of cities, with beaches and the areas around them, or in national parks. And the way that these are constructed is to create a set of assets that generate income to counterbalance the liabilities of running the green infrastructure. And those sorts of assets can include concessions for cafes and rental of sports pitches and other things like that. And that actually can be sufficient to pay for all the ongoing maintenance costs of the green infrastructure. So if the local authorities are prepared, or others are prepared to endow the vehicle with sufficient assets, then you can actually create a sustainable financial model going forwards for those. When thinking about where to put the green infrastructure, there are a couple of considerations. First off, you need opportunities for enhancement of either the quality or the function of the infrastructure if you're going to improve it, or potentially to make the existing grey infrastructure greener, where there is an opportunity to actually increase the extent or improve the quality of the existing green infrastructure. And then for greenfield sites, of course, there's opportunity to create new functions in the land itself to create recreational opportunities or habitat creation or whatever. So there's where the opportunities are in terms of the land that's available and the demand from people, but there's also a question of equity. I mean, if you look at this, this is just an example of a map, so I can point out to you that there are areas on any map where people have more access to green infrastructure than others. And in this map of London, this area here is particularly poor in access in parks and other public green space. And it's also has some fairly deprived areas socioeconomically as well. So you can target those within your infrastructure plan, your green infrastructure plan, to bring those areas which are currently deprived up to some sort of standard and allow them to catch up with everyone else. Now my timer has gone to sleep, or rather Julia's timer has gone to sleep, so you'll have to tell me. You tell me when I've got 5 minutes left. Yeah, okay, thanks. So just to recap, we've looked at the 25-year plan and thought about some of the opportunities which are currently possible with the policy we have today that might provide greater income opportunities. Then we thought about the types of opportunities that we get in cities and outside and what some of the prioritization might be. And then I just want to round off with a few more comments. So first of all, the key elements here seem to be to create a balance of assets and liabilities. In some cases, we can have external contributions coming into green infrastructure from Section 106, from service charges, from leases and enterprise investment and so on. So that can be part of the model. That's not going to work for all sorts of green infrastructure, obviously. The second thing is to think very hard about having a value-based strategy. So that means putting the green infrastructure where the value is highest, where there is demand for people. So you put the green infrastructure close to people. And I know that sounds obvious, but we honestly don't always do that. And also think about an equitable strategy where the people who have less access at the moment get more of a larger share of the investment. and then trying to develop these models in a standard low-cost fashion, because it's very, very expensive to get the lawyers in to sort out all the commercial arrangements for these things and all the establishment. So we need standard low-cost models, otherwise it will simply be too expensive to go forward with it. If we can pool the opportunities together and do it in a programmatic way, it will be more efficient and we'll get better value out of it. So that means bringing together various green infrastructure assets into one vehicle or under one roof, and then potentially building those assets out slightly ahead of the money coming in, providing we're reasonably sure that the money will come in. So we can think about structures, and this is just a cartoon sort of structure, where we have a vehicle with some equity contributed to it and maybe some other sources of funding, and it has certain liabilities, it's certain commitments of expenditure and maintenance and a capital program and so on, and then a range of sources of revenue. These are the sorts of things that we should be at least considering in our urban areas, potentially in our national parks and around our beaches and so on. The other advantage of some of these sorts of vehicles is that it allows you to develop more transparent and effective governance structures with clearer objectives of what the assets are trying, what you're trying to deliver, what services you're trying to deliver. Okay, so before I finish, it's also worth saying that there are some more novel sources of income, such as from health services, because green infrastructure can contribute quite a lot to improved physical and mental health, but we don't yet see that being monetizable. We need more evidence on the way in which people can target interventions on particular groups of disease groups and create effective health outcomes from those. But if that happens and those interventions then are approved by NICE, then all sorts of like environmental prescribing might become possible. And there's certainly very great interest in the health sector in taking that forwards. So I thank you very much for your attention.